Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We're just allowing a few more participants to join the meeting, but that number seems to have stopped going up. So I will formally welcome you all to another virtual Parliamentary and Scientific Committee discussion meeting, one of a series that we've had over the last few months. And one of the advantages, of course, is we are able to have a greater attendance than if we were meeting in some of the crowded rooms in Parliament. So you are all very welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. The topic for this evening's discussion is sources, health benefits, and global challenges of protein, which I think will be a subject certainly that I don't know a great deal about, but like all these meetings, that's the purpose of them, is to become better informed. And I'm sure that by the end of our session, we will know a great deal more and have a better understanding of what the sources, health benefits, and challenges of protein are. I'd like to thank the Nutrition Society for their help and support in sponsoring tonight's meeting and providing us with three very distinguished speakers. I will introduce you all to them briefly now, and then we will obviously hear from each of them. Dr. Jorn Trommelen, Assistant Professor, Department of Human Biology, Maastricht University, welcome. Professor Ailsa Welch, who is Professor of Nutritional Epidemiology, Norwich Medical School, University of East Anglia, welcome. And Professor Andy Salter, who is Professor of Nutritional Biochemistry, School of Biosciences, University of East Anglia. So welcome all three of you. As is usual with these events, if I could remind everyone to remain muted unless you are actually making a contribution, that will help improve the sound quality. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions. My proposal would be to go through the three presentations and then come to questions after that. Each of our speakers will speak, I hope they know, for approximately 12 minutes. I will try and keep you to time, but obviously we are very keen to hear what you have to say. If I unmute, it probably means that I'm about to say that, could you start to wrap up? But as I say, I'm not that strict. I just want to leave enough time for some Q&A at the end. So I think that's probably all the housekeeping, in which case I'm going to invite our first speaker to talk to us, who is Jorn Trommelen. Jorn.
Thank you. So I will discuss why we need dietary protein and explain some important considerations with respect to challenges of our modern society. So there are three main macronutrients: carbohydrate, fat, and protein. And these are the nutrients that provide energy. And for carbohydrate and fat, that is their main function. However, the main function of protein is to provide building blocks for our tissues. And now you may wonder, do we really need building blocks? It seems evident that growing children might need a lot of building blocks, but what about adults? Well, I invite you to have a look at your left arm, and you may think, well, that's my left arm, it's there for a while, but it's interesting to know that your arm is completely new every 30 days or so. So it's completely broken down. All proteins, the whole muscle is completely broken down and then build up again from scratch. So you think you have the same arm, but it's completely new every month. And here we see that process in a little bit more detail. It's called protein turnover. So you have your tissues that consist out of protein, and in a process called protein breakdown, the tissues are broken down to its building blocks called amino acids. And then these amino acids can be incorporated again in the tissues in a process called protein synthesis. Now, this seems like a huge waste because it's just a circle that keeps going, but it's not, because this allows your tissues to continuously renew itself, and therefore the tissue quality always remains high. You never have old damaged tissue, you always have new optimally functioning tissues. However, while you can recycle a lot of the amino acids that are formed when you break down your tissues, you do need some input from outside protein. So you need to consume dietary protein, which will be digested into amino acids, and then these amino acids will also get incorporated into your tissues. So every time we consume a meal, for example, breakfast, lunch, and dinner that contains protein, we stimulate this process of protein synthesis, so depositing amino acids into our tissues. And over the day, protein synthesis and breakdown fluctuate. And in adults, these two processes are more or less in balance over a 24-hour period. So the question is, how much protein should we eat? Well, here we see data. The black bars are the grams of consumed protein expressed per body weight for different age categories. And in the blue line represents the recommendation, the protein recommendation for children, while the red line represents the protein recommendation for adults. And these are the recommendations from the World Health Organization. And the first thing that you'll notice is that all age categories, they seem to consume enough protein to begin with. So that's a pretty good sign. Now, it's important to note that not everyone agrees on these guidelines. Some people say these are enough to prevent deficiencies. It's not necessarily the optimal amount, but one thing that is very clear is that most people are definitely not wasting away because they don't consume enough protein. However, there is one population, well, there are several, but one important population that deserves a little bit extra attention, and that are older adults. Older adults, they lose muscle mass as they age, but this problem might be bigger than most people realize. For example, we can make a scan of the upper leg, and then you get these type of images. So on the left, you see what's the inside of a leg of a healthy young male, and you see that almost everything is gray, so muscle tissue. Well, on the right, we see the same type of scan from an older adult. And now you see there's a lot more black, so a lot more fat tissue, and the fat tissue is also infiltrated the muscle. And when we look at the circumference, the right leg is just as big and maybe even a little bit bigger than the left leg. So when we would look at this older adult, we wouldn't think of, oh, this person is wasting away. He has very little muscle mass, because he has quite a bit of body, but actually the amount and the quality of his muscle tissue is very small. And this is a huge problem in our modern society, because as we get older and older, we cannot really participate in the workforce. We're reliant on healthcare. So trying to improve the physical capabilities of our older adults is very important. And a lot of researchers now believe that older adults should consume more protein than what the World Health Organization is recommending. So here is an example of an article where researchers suggest older adults, they might have to eat at least 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram per day, which is 50% higher than what the World Health Organization recommends to all adults. So if you go back to this figure, I've now shown the recommendation that a lot of protein researchers agree on. And then we see, for older adults, they tend to eat below that on average. So again, most adults and also most children, they eat plenty of protein, and it's not a concern. But older adults, they are a population where we should be careful with what they're eating and whether or not they have a risk of inadequacy. Now, a second topic I quickly want to cover is protein quality. So this refers to the fact that not all dietary protein may be equal. And one distinction that we make is animal protein versus plant-based protein, where plant-based protein might have a lower quality. To explain that, I want to use an analogy. If you want to build a house, you need bricks, you need windows, you need doors, and you can have all the bricks in the world, but if you have no windows, you cannot really build a proper house. And the same thing happens with your tissues. You don't need just one type of building block. You need several different types of building blocks. And animal protein, while they have usually a reasonable amount of building blocks, so essential amino acids, very often they lack one or more specific amino acids, and then you can't really use the other ones. So there's a couple of issues with plant protein. The first issue is that people on a plant-based diet just tend to consume less protein in general. A steak has more protein than broccoli. You would have to eat a lot of broccoli to get the same amount of protein. But even the protein that is in plant-based products, they have that lower essential amino acid content. And then even when the essential amino acid content is high enough, it often lacks one or more specific essential amino acids. And then the final concern is not all the protein in in plant-based products is properly digested. So it's in the product, but that doesn't mean that if you consume it, it becomes available to the body. So for all these reasons, there is some concern that plant-based protein might be less efficient than animal-based protein. Now, this sounds very bad, but that's not necessarily the case, because if you consume enough protein, so if your protein quantity is high, then this is not really a concern. So is a move towards more plant-based protein okay for most adults? I would say yes, because some of the older speakers will cover that there's also some advantages to that. However, for the older adults who are already at risk of inadequate protein intake, then the lower protein quality of a plant-based diet might be concerning. So I'm going to move to my final topic, and I'm just going to cover this very briefly. Physical activity, incredibly important for many reasons. I don't have to explain this. But what's interesting is when we consume protein, the amino acids in the protein, after you absorb them and just hours after the ingestion, you can find those exact same building blocks back in your own tissues. So a milk protein, just a couple hours after consumption, has become muscle protein in your body, for example. So you are literally what you eat. If you now consume your glass of milk, 2 hours later, those building blocks are in your leg as muscle tissue. But that's not just dependent on how much and what type of protein you ingest. It's highly dependent on how much physical activity you perform. Of course, you have bodybuilding training. The more you exercise, the bigger your muscles get. But I want to focus more on the other part, inactivity. For example, we have done a lot of research where, for example, people in a hospital, can we try to prevent muscle loss by supplementing with protein? And that doesn't really seem to work, because if the muscle isn't doing much, if there's barely any physical activity, the muscle can't really use the protein we consume. So you really need a combination of protein and physical activity. So with that, I'm at my 3 main takeaways, and these are in order of importance. Physical activity allows more efficient use of ingested protein, and any amount counts. So no, it doesn't have to be, not the whole population has to do bodybuilding training. Anything helps. If we can stimulate more people cycling to work, great. If we can stimulate an increase in daily step count, absolutely great. 2, older adults are at risk of inadequate protein intake, so something to be aware of, and that ties into number 3. A more plant-based diet is generally less efficient to meet protein requirements. I don't think that's a big concern for most people. However, for populations that are already at risk of insufficient protein intake, for example, older adults, I think we have to be careful there. So as some of my colleagues will discuss, for example, plant-based protein is more sustainable, but that doesn't mean that everyone has to move towards a more plant-based diet. And finally, I want to give an overview of our government and industrial partners over the years. Thank you.
Jorn, thank you very much indeed. Fascinating. As I said at the beginning, I learn something every time, and the fact that my left arm is replaced every 30 days is a fact that I will be quoting regularly, I'm sure. Just a quick follow-up question, if I may. If that process of regeneration happens every 30 days, is the loss of muscle mass as people grow older purely due to the lack of activity that they undertake? If that muscle is being renewed all the time, if you don't use it, you lose it type effect. So the aging process can be not so much reversed, but halted by continuing regular activity through life with the right amount of protein.
Yeah, so physical activity is the main determinant of muscle mass, but it's definitely not the only one. So you see that if older adults do extra exercise, they just tend to have more muscle mass than age-related counterparts. But it won't completely, like, it's unlikely that you'll have a 70-plus-year-old bodybuilder, for example, but they'll just be much better off. Well, extra protein intake will stimulate muscle mass maintenance even more, but there's also other nutrients, as my colleagues will address, for example. Other factors also play a role, but yes, physical activity is the main one, and also one of the easiest we can influence as an individual.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Right. We will move on to our second contribution, which is, as I said, from Professor Ailsa Welch, Professor of Nutritional Epidemiology, Norwich Medical School, University of East Anglia. Ailsa.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay, and that you can see the slides okay. I think it looks as though you should be able to. Yes, so it's a very great pleasure to talk to you tonight. And actually, Steve and I am going to answer some of your questions in the course of what I was about to say. I'm really going to take a slightly more clinical and public health approach to what we're saying today. And I'm talking about diet quality and the impact on sarcopenia, health and aging. And I'm going to focus a little more on micronutrients, and these are vitamins and minerals. They're present in very tiny quantities in the diet, so you couldn't really see them on a teaspoon, whereas you could see an amount of protein on a teaspoon, so there's a very different quantity. However, although they're small, they are really important for metabolism, physiology, and when they become deficient or insufficient, then that causes us huge amounts of problems. Also, we do have malnutrition, and already Jorn has mentioned protein, and if it's very deficient, particularly in aging, then that's an issue. But we also have micronutrient malnutrition, and the two conditions quite often coexist. So I'm also going to talk about the relevance of micronutrients, the mechanisms of aging, and how they interact with protein. Again, there's a further answer to your question. And then talk about sarcopenia and other conditions of aging. Move on to diet quality and micronutrient-dense foods. These are foods that are high in vitamins and minerals. And then talk more about UK population eating habits and recommendations. And obviously what we would prefer is to have people who are in the top box here that I've just shown you, who are obviously able to move around and able to continue to function in society, as opposed to this poor lady who I can show you who has malnutrition. So to also note that part of the condition of sarcopenia, which is one of the problems of aging, also includes the loss of strength or power and increasing physical weakness. This also links to fractures, which are caused by osteoporosis, and there's a definition at the top there of low bone density. And basically, women who are, if you're anywhere near the age of 50, by the time you end your life, you will have actually likely to have had one or other of you or your friend will have had a fragility fracture by the end of your life. And men don't get off scot-free either. They have 1 in 5 men also have fractures. We also have the aging condition of frailty, which is a whole combination of different issues in terms of weakness, vulnerability, physical and metabolic decline, and includes sarcopenia. So Jorn has already covered protein synthesis, but one of the, and it's highly important too, we need that. But what we've been finding is that many of the interventions, particularly for sarcopenia, frailty, malnutrition, have mixed effects. So we've been, I've been, and other researchers have been studying other vitamins and minerals to see what effect they have. We now know that vitamin D is important for muscle, both muscle mass and function. We've been also looking at vitamin C, vitamin E, and some carotenes, and then minerals such as magnesium and iron, and then patterns that are known to be healthy, such as Mediterranean diet. But I'm going to illustrate some of the concepts from vitamin C and magnesium, which are, I'm going to show you very, very briefly some results of research. So the reason why I think these are interesting particularly is because we need enough magnesium to synthesize protein. And we also need vitamin C to make collagen, which is part of the structure both of muscle and bones. And then both of these nutrients are also important in energy production. So if you want your muscles to function and to contract, you need enough of these nutrients to generate the energy. So you might be thinking, well, we're talking about aging. This doesn't really impact on me at the moment. I'm not that old. But actually, the bad news is that once you get to over the age of 30, you're going to start to decline whatever happens. So, and you can see here, this is a graphic of muscle strength with age. And you can see in the life stages. So we accumulate in early adult life and then start to gently decline. And the level of that decline and the amount is likely to impact on a number of lifestyle factors. What we know for muscle mass is we lose between 1% and 2% and force up to 3% per year. The other thing that's happening here is that it's accompanied by an increase in the mechanisms of aging. So you've got a losses and this, so this graph also applies to bone, muscle mass, and a number of other conditions. So it also is important that we have sufficient of the nutrients for growth, development, and cognition, particularly in younger adults and children. So what we would ideally want to do would be to prevent this progress to sarcopenia and frailty, and also maintain a healthy lifespan in the population. So what we already know is that although sarcopenia is a fairly new condition, we know that at least 1/3 of people, both in the community and in care, have that, and frailty, over 1/4 of people over the age of 80. What people realize less is that as we get older, if we're losing muscle, this is a metabolic organ. And the thing with that is that actually it's burning energy. It's also using the glucose that we produce when we have carbohydrates such as bread and so on. So, and actually, because this is an energy giving, because energy is burnt by muscle, once we start to lose muscle, then we start to lose the capacity to use glucose and energy. And this is likely contributing to the onset of type 2 diabetes as well as obesity. And I've already talked about falls and fractures as well. And coupled with all this, then we have malnutrition, which is existing in the community. We already know that about 30% or 1/3 of people have malnutrition of some form in the community. So this is costing huge amounts to government, health and social care. We know that malnutrition alone costs 13 billion a year. And so this is also causing a big problem for our society because we've got the aging populations and the baby boomer bulge. Very briefly, I'm going to discuss what the mechanisms and interaction of nutrition with the mechanisms of aging. One of the key, I suppose you could call it key crime or a key problem, is the rise in inflammation with aging. And this is the increase of circulating molecules that are called such as C-reactive protein. We also have this increase in what's known as oxidative stress. And what we know is that inflammation and oxidative stress both combine to make each other worse and increase protein turnover, which you've already heard about. But malnutrition is also a risk factor for increasing aging. We know, as Jorn has explained, that protein is highly important as a structural nutrient, but also there are nutrients that have antioxidant ability, and these are vitamin C and magnesium that can dampen down some of the mechanisms of aging. So a brief slide to show you that evidence is accumulating. This is some of my research that shows that magnesium and vitamin C are important for aging. And this data shows some data in women who we looked at their diets and we divided their diet into 5 parts. So these are the lowest intakes and these are the highest. And this is for leg explosive power, which is it's a measure of function. And what we found was that when we compared the top and the bottom categories, the people at the top were 24% better, which is huge. So as a summary also of other findings that we have, I've looked at diet for magnesium, vitamin C, both in diet and blood. We've looked at muscle mass and muscle function. We looked at men and we looked at women in a number of cohorts. And what we find is across the scale of these categories, by and large, there's a difference of between about 3 to 8%. So that's doesn't seem again very much, but actually what you find is that compared with the 1 to 2% losses during each year, that actually this could be clinically significant. So what we know also is that micronutrient deficiency causes symptoms. And you may have heard scurvy, and this causes listlessness, weakness, and fatigue. Magnesium does similar things. And we also, you know about anemia, you'll have all heard about that. Again, that causes weakness and fatigue, and a number of nutrients are involved in that, and that includes B vitamins and iron. And then vitamin D produces osteomalacia, which gives painful muscles and fatigue. So, you know, these are a real perfect storm, particularly if someone's got more than one of those. The reason, by and large, people have deficiencies is because of low intakes. But actually also, you know, you have to start to think that these are the symptoms of aging and also the symptoms of sarcopenia and frailty. So very briefly, I'm conscious of time and I'm hoping it's not too bad. I forgot to check what the timing was when I started. We know that people have those with scurvy.
About 4 minutes. That's
how many? Sorry?
About 4 minutes.
Yes, actually, I'm fine in that case, yes. So blood concentrations that are indicative of scurvy, we know that in institutions, about 4 in 10 people have those concentrations. So again, they're suffering from the symptoms. Magnesium intakes are very low, and both iron deficiency and vitamin D deficiency are between about 40 and 50% in institutions. So to highlight where we get these foods from, these nutrients from, vitamin C comes from a range of different fruits and vegetables, as well as potatoes. Magnesium is far more wide-ranging. It includes fruits and vegetables, but also it includes meat and fish and cereal foods. So we know that we have good guidelines for how to meet all our nutrient requirements, including protein, as well as these vitamins and minerals. And you can see these, and they're on the Public Health England website. And you can see the idea is that people eat 5 portions of fruits and veg a day, good amounts of cereal foods, and then also, you know, moderate amounts of protein, and really trying to eat far less than people do at the moment of things like crisps and chocolates and sweets. But actually what is really concerning is the fact that in people over the age of 75 in this country, from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, which has very good statistics on how we are doing in nutrition in this country, at least only 20% of people consume 5 a day. So there are examples of how sort of age groups that are actually compromised by malnutrition or deficiency, and these include older age groups, low income groups, people who follow a vegan or vegetarian eating pattern if they're not following that in a very careful way. And in care homes, we know that the prevalence of malnutrition is 35%. So this is my last slide to talk about recommendations and conclusions, because clearly physical activity is important and we need to really encourage the population, both individual and population approaches. I hope that I've shown you very briefly that diet quality is important for both health and aging, and that there are effects of both protein, energy and micronutrient malnutrition, that these nutrients interact with the mechanisms of aging and also chronic diseases. And so the best bet really for everyone is to consume a balanced diet, rich in micronutrients with adequate protein, because quite frankly, prevention is better than a cure. So I'd like to thank you for listening to this, and sorry it was a little bit fast, but I hope it's of interest, and recent funding and acknowledgements of the cohorts I've been working with.
Ailsa, thank you very much. That was fascinating. also slightly concerning for us reaching those older ages. I suppose two observations. One is, I mean, obviously you can demonstrate the importance of magnesium and vitamin C and therefore potentially other micronutrients as well. Would you support a move to sort of widespread vitamin supplements being taken in addition to trying to follow the healthy diet? And the other thing is I wanted to mention is presumably therefore there is, while there may not necessarily be a connection between weight and malnutrition depending on what you're eating.
Yes, well, the first question really, supplements are a difficult one. We know that for vitamin D, we do need to be taking supplements in this country because there isn't really sufficient in the diet, and it's very hard to meet that, particularly if you follow a plant-based diet. But there's a difficulty in really, because I've concentrated on vitamin C and magnesium to show the principles, but in fact, there are many nutrients that are deficient, and so we would be much wiser to try and improve the diet in the country in general if we can. Obviously, if people are older and can't take the volume of food, or they have other reasons, then supplements are possible, but a lot of them actually also combine or interact with drugs that people are taking, particularly when they're on polypharmacy when they're older. So that's not so good. In terms of malnutrition and obesity and so on, what we do know is that most people who are overweight are likely to have worse concentrations of the micronutrients in blood by and large. And while somebody might look hale and hearty, they can also have sarcopenic obesity, which I refrain from talking about, but that is because people have weakness, and both weakness and metabolic problems with that.
Thank you. Yes. So never quite as simple as we would like it to be.
No, I'm afraid not. Not in 11 minutes anyway.
Indeed. Ailsa, thank you very much indeed. We will now move on to our third speaker. And if I can just remind people to post their potential questions in the Q&A. And if any of our panelists want to answer those questions either on screen or just by typing into the Q&A, please feel free to do so. Right, and our third and final speaker is Andy Salter, Professor Andy Salter, Professor of Nutritional Biochemistry at School of Biosciences, again at the University of East Anglia. Andy, if you could give us your presentation. Thank you.
Apologies. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, that's fine, Andy.
Okay. Just go to slide. That's it. Perfect.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. If I can just correct Stephen on one point, I'm not actually from the University of East Anglia. I'm actually from the University of Nottingham. But that's
huge apologies.
No problems at all.
Down as University of East Anglia on my list, but I apologise.
Okay, that's fine. So I'm going to finish off today talking about the future, if you like, and how we're going to meet the future demands of for protein for the global population and indeed our own population, and more particularly how we're going to do this sustainably without doing any further damage to our planet. The slide here is some modelling that we recently did, just looking at the future needs, and this is the future needs of adults across the planet. Children obviously have a vital requirement for protein, but it's adults that are consuming most of it. And the top line there, the blue line, is the global requirement. And as you can see, through the rest of this century, that is going to increase quite dramatically. But interestingly, if you look at the lower lines, you see that it's not distributed across the world. At the moment, the highest protein requirement by quite a distance is in Asia, the grace-coloured line. But that rise in protein is all going to be on one continent, essentially, and that is in Africa, assuming that we see the level of population growth which has been predicted. So we need to try and meet this increase. We need to meet it for that particular continent, which has problems already, as we'll see, and we need to try and meet that sustainably. This shows the current sources of dietary protein on the far left-hand side in the world in general, and then as we move across the different continents. And I put a line in there which just gives you an indication of the requirements of an adult of, say, 70 kilograms in weight. And as you can see, in the world, we're actually consuming overall more protein than we need at that sort of level. And something like maybe between a third and a half of that protein is coming from animal sources, meat, milk and other dairy products, and fish, and the rest is coming from plant sources. But the big bar there, the yellow bar, is from cereals, and it's just showing us that a high proportion of our protein is coming from cereals, which is not a great source of protein in terms of quality, and I'll say more about that. However, when you move across and look at the different parts of the world, you see some very different patterns in both the amount of protein and the source of protein which is being consumed. In Africa, which they say is where all the growth is going to be, we're already seeing the most deficient protein, just about meeting that level for our 70 kilogram adult. So that means that many people are probably getting suboptimal amount of protein already, and we're going to see that population grow substantially. And again, a very small proportion of that protein in Africa is coming from animal sources, the so-called high quality protein we've talked about, and a large proportion is coming from those plant sources, particularly the cereals. We move across to Asia, things are getting a little bit better, and then by the time we get into the Americas, Europe and Oceania, we can see we're consuming vastly more protein than we need, with very high levels of animal protein, the highest level of animal protein, and a lesser contribution from those plant proteins. Unfortunately, that excess protein that we're consuming doesn't come without some cost, because if we consume more protein than we actually need, we end up just excreting it in our urine as urea, and without proper mitigation of the sewage systems in some parts of the world, that pollutes our waterways and causes what we call nitrification. So this graph just shows us a little bit more about what I've called the global protein balance sheet. And it starts with the protein we're actually producing. And the big yellow bar on the left is the edible crops that we grow and the protein associated with them. And there's a smaller amount in green, which is the pasture, which we and many other animal species can't actually use as a source of protein, but fortunately animals such as ruminants, cows, and our sheep and goats can actually take this and obviously convert it into meat, which is a high source of protein. So as you can see, the total amount of protein there is approaching 250 grams per person, which is vastly more than we'd actually need if we were consuming that directly. As you move towards the right, the post-harvest position, you can see that a large proportion of that protein is actually going into animal feed. Obviously, all of the pasture, but a significant proportion of the edible crops. The yellow bar is the amount which is coming through to our own food systems, and then there's the waste post-harvest that we're seeing in grey at the bottom. As we move to what I've called the pre-processing step, there's another big loss, and it's the loss associated with producing animals. It's the protein that the animals are losing due to the turnover that we were hearing about earlier as they grow, and it's the amount which is lost because we don't tend to eat the whole animal carcass quite understandably. So we're left with the meat and dairy and fish in red, which we can consume, and then the remaining crops which we can consume, and we finally get to what the consumer gets. As I've said, across the world generally, that's still in excess of what we probably require. The blue part of that bar is our requirement, the light grey is the excess, and sadly, the darker grey is that which tends to get thrown away either by our supermarkets or from our own homes. So that's the sort of balance sheet that we have in terms of our current global situation. So we've heard a little bit about meat and plant sources of protein. I just very briefly want to rehearse some of the pros and cons, if you like, of meat consumption from a nutritional, not an animal welfare point of view. That's a different argument, which we haven't got time to go into. So from a nutritional point of view, meat is a source of high quality protein. And as we've heard, that means it's not only got the right mix of the indispensable or essential amino acids, it's also highly digestible. It's a good source of some specific other micronutrients that we've been talking about. It's a good source of iron, it's a good source of zinc and selenium, good source of vitamin D, and one of the only sources, or the few sources, of actual vitamin B12. Where the availability of plant-based foods may be limited, often we can stop there being a specific deficiency in protein or specific amino acids by introducing a relatively small amount of animal-based foods, particularly meat, into the diet. On the other side, however, there's no doubt that in much of the industrialized, the richer world, excessive consumption of energy-dense meat and dairy products is associated with obesity, which can lead to type 2 diabetes, and associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, largely because of the high content of saturated fat. There's now considerable evidence that fresh and particularly processed red meat can contribute to colorectal cancer. And then there's an unsustainable burden of the resources we have to put into producing that meat. I've already shown you how a lot of the protein goes to waste. There's also a lot of land used to produce crops which we feed to our animals, and indeed a lot of our fresh water goes in producing those animals. On top of that, of course, particularly those ruminants I was talking about, the cows in particular, directly produce methane, a greenhouse gas, which can add to pollution. And I mentioned already that they themselves, in growing, are excreting used amino acids in the form of urea and adding to that nitrogen pollution. So while there's little doubt that reducing meat consumption amongst the world's wealthiest populations would have both environmental and health benefits, meat and other animal products represent an important source of nutrition, particularly for the world's most vulnerable individuals, whether we're talking about the poorest people, for example, in Africa and Asia, or indeed some of the poorest people in our own societies. So what's the answer? How can we make our produced protein going forward more sustainably? Well, some of you may have seen, it certainly caused quite a stir in the scientific community, the production of the so-called Eat Lancet report and the so-called healthy reference diet they suggested. And this suggested a marked change in where we're getting our proteins from, with a dramatic decrease in the amount of red and processed meat, the lamb, the beef, the pork, and an equally dramatic increase in some of the plant-based sources of high value protein, such as legumes and soy foods, peanuts and tree nuts. And this was the balance sheet that Eat Lancet came up with. And just to try and put that into some sort of context, the pictures on the right-hand side show you what that would mean. It would mean that in terms of red meat, we would be consuming less than 1/4 pounder burger a day. Now, some of you may think that's a good idea, but that's a big change to what we're normally eating, which is something like 132 grams of red meat a day. But equally, it's a dramatic change in the amount of beans, lentils, peas, and nuts that we consume. And again, that they're suggesting in total about 125 grams of these plant-based foods. And in the UK, we're consuming on average about 21 grams, so about 6 times less than they're recommending. That's a major challenge, both in terms of changing consumer behavior and in terms of changing our agricultural practices and our food industry and food production. In the last few years, we've probably seen a move towards this, and certainly pre-COVID, there was a lot of interest in moving to more plant-based diets, and many of us saw an increase in the number of what we call meat analogues, plant-based meat substitutes in our supermarkets. I just want to highlight one thing, and this isn't to pick on these particular firms, and it's certainly not a full survey. It was just me going around the supermarket looking at what was available. And when some of these meat alternatives turn up, they are much more expensive than the meat equivalent. So we've got our beef burgers there at the top left-hand corner, and most of these these plant-based alternatives are at least 2 and almost 3 times the price. And again, for our most vulnerable people in our society, and food poverty obviously is something on your agenda a lot at the moment, it's certainly something to consider. So for the last part of my talk, I just want to say a little bit about what we're doing at the University of Nottingham in terms of looking forward to how we're going to meet some of these challenges in protein production, both for food, but particularly I want to emphasize animal feed, because I think all of our talks have suggested that while we should perhaps reduce consumption of animal foods in some parts of the world, they're going to be with us for some considerable time and meeting some of the needs of some of our most vulnerable people. So we've been looking at some of these alternative sources and list some of the ones we're actively involved in looking at. We've got plant sources, some legumes such as wing bean and bambara, which can be grown in the tropics but aren't used widespread at the moment. And that's largely because of the presence of what we call anti-nutritional factors, which reduce their digestibility. And we're looking at how this can be improved. I've got duckweed listed there. Anybody who's got a pond knows how quickly that grows. And in fact, it's quite a rich source of protein. And again, has potential both in terms of animal feed and possibly human food. And horse gram is another legume which is consumed already in Asia, but again has these anti-nutritional factors. There's been a lot of interest in insects in the last 5 years or so. A figure you'll often hear is that about 2 billion people already eat insects as part of their normal diet. And there has been some move in the West towards this, particularly with crickets. And there's a number of products available which are made with what we call cricket flour, which is a high protein ground up crickets essentially. Mealworms are consumed directly by people in some parts of the world, particularly in Asia, but we're particularly interested in mealworms and these black soldier fly larvae as potential animal feed. And then at the bottom, you've got the single cell organisms. The one which is already well established, of course, is mycoprotein. Most of you will know that as corn, which is actually a fungus, which has been incorporated into many meat analogues. But again, one of our particular interests are taking bacteria. There's the methanotropic bacteria, and perhaps most exciting, bacteria that can actually fix carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And bacteria, as I'll show you in a minute, potentially are a rich source of protein, which could be used as animal and particularly fish feed. Some very brief examples. This was some of our earliest work in this area, trying to replace fish meal. And fish meal is made from wild caught fish. So we go around catching fish from the sea and feeding them to our farm fish, which obviously is not sustainable. So we tried to replace some of that fish meal with insect meal. This was black soldier fly larvae fed on plant waste. And what we found in this study, looking at sea bass with our colleagues in the Crops for the Future in Malaysia, was you could replace about half of the fish meal with insect meal without affecting the growth and the efficiency of production of the fish. So that was very promising. Higher than that, and you started to see some deterioration in their production characteristics, but 50% would be a good start. Equally, more recently, we've been looking at trying to replace soya in the diet of chickens with mealworms or ground up mealworms. And as you can see in the picture, the chickens were very happy to eat it. And the graph shows that in replacing at least some of the soya, we got almost identical growth curves. So again, potentially exciting that we could replace some of that soya with insect meal. And then finally, as I say, bacteria. We're about to do some, we're hoping we're about to do some fish feeding studies with some of these carbon dioxide fixing bacteria, if we can get our labs fully up and running again. And as you can see, bacteria are a very good source of protein with variable amounts of other nutrients. The problem we see at the moment is that NC-LCFA, which are the omega-3 fatty acids, which are rich in some of, particularly of our sea fish, which is not available in the bacteria. So that's the end of my talk and just some conclusions. There's an urgent need to rethink how we're going to meet our global protein requirements. That offers challenges and opportunities for both agriculture and the food industry. The biggest increases will be seen in Africa. In the industrialized countries, as we've heard, we've got changes in the demographics, which means we've got to specifically increase the amount of protein available to the elderly. Animal agriculture is putting an intolerable burden on our planetary resources, and we need to find some solutions to that. An alternative source of protein might be one of those solutions. but there's still many factors to overcome, particularly in making it economic, efficient, and sustainable to produce some of these things. And that's some of the research we're working on. Thank you very much.
Andy, thank you very much indeed. Fascinating stuff. I was interested that on one of the slides it said we needed about 1/10 of the amount of red meat that we have at the moment, but only 6 times more of the plant protein. Is that, how does that deficiency or calculation work?
I mean, obviously, if you looked within that balance sheet, it wasn't just, you weren't just simply replacing the meat with those sources. There's actually, globally, there's a suggestion that we actually increase our consumption of dairy, and that's a challenge in actually how we produce those dairy animals. Chicken, for many parts of the world, it actually is an increase, while in the West it's probably a decrease. So it's a whole balance sheet there of all of the different things.
Okay, great, thank you. Right, we're now going to move on to questions. My first question is from our president, which is Lord Brewers. Alec, is someone going to unmute you so you can ask your question? I think Ben would be responsible for that, is that right?
Can you hear me?
We can, perfect.
Yeah, my question was just about the efficiency in the use of the ingested protein by exercise. And I wanted to know whether it was better to exercise very hard or for very long.
I'll try to answer that one. In general, a higher exercise intensity is better, but it's not required. You can compensate for the intensity by just doing more. So if, for example, older adults might be a bit intimidated by doing some kind of weight training or intensive exercise, in that case, I would recommend just do what you feel comfortable and just do a little bit more of it. Like, the main thing is try to do what you can. The optimal, like just doing what you can is 80% of the battle. How you do it exactly doesn't matter that much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. And glad you could join us, Alec. Next question is from my colleague, Carol Moynihan, who is one of the vice chairs of the committee. I think someone will unmute you, Carol, and then you will be able to ask.
Thanks, Stephen. Can you hear me?
We can.
Good. I'm using a headset, so it's a bit awkward here. Thanks very much for 3 excellent presentations. I actually messaged Stephen during that to say, was he getting as worried about his diet and aging as I was? So I think there's a lot that we can take out. But I put my question in the Q&A in the chat there. Is there a difficulty? We know that, especially us in the west of Scotland, we suffer a lot from heart disease. Is there a difficulty if we're talking about types of protein, if we're elderly people are increasing, for example, meat-based proteins, that they could actually be causing themselves other problems?
Who would like to take that?
Maybe, shall I start?
Please.
Yeah, so I think it depends on how much protein you're having. And one of the things is that many sources of animal protein are actually not, although they can be high in saturated fat, a lot aren't so much anymore. So I think it's about the balance between those things. I think there are other foods that contribute a lot of saturated fat anyway. So they're the ones I would probably be slightly more concerned about in some ways. So I think it, but also it depends a bit on how old people are, because once people get to a certain age, they really do need the sources of nutrients, and whilst cardiovascular disease is an issue, it's maybe slightly less of an issue perhaps than decline and not being able to walk or function, and there's other. Sorry, it's not a very clear answer, but I think it's not entirely. People need a balanced diet with enough protein, with all those other foods such as vegetables and so on that actually counteract that. And one thing we also know is that I didn't talk about it, but say, for instance, vitamin C is protective for cardiovascular disease and diabetes in the diet. So, eating a kind of balanced diet with with some protein foods and making sure people have enough of those vegetables particularly, and balanced with other foods. I think that's important. The other thing also I should say is, though they're less concentrated sources of protein, you can get protein in most foods. I mean, so long as people are combining, again, the types of foods, then they're less likely to have a problem.
Can I just maybe add as well, I mean, certain animal sources, poultry, fish, low-fat dairy, semi-skim milk and skim milk, are all excellent sources of high-value protein, but low sources of saturated fat, which is one of the main concerns about heart disease. Thank you.
Stephen, can I ask a very quick supplementary to Andy then?
Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask then, should we, as we're getting older, increase the amount of red meat, for example, or other types of meat that we're eating?
I think I'd get, it wouldn't be right for me to say, yes, that's the only way to do it. You have to make sure that you're taking in sufficient high quality protein, and it's more difficult if you're on a vegetarian diet. You probably need a wider range of foods that you're consuming. I wouldn't necessarily recommend lots of red meat. I would certainly, recommend the alternatives I've said, such as fish and poultry as well, alongside that.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen, for indulging me.
No, thank you. I just think I'm going to change the order of the questions here slightly, because Paul Ridout has sort of got a follow-up to that, I think. Paul? Paul?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Thanks, Paul.
Very simple question. Are protein supplements beneficial for older people?
Andy, do you want to follow up on that?
I'm going to ask one of my more clinical colleagues to maybe address that first.
I'm going to let Jorn answer that one first.
Yes. So we've done research in that, but the effect is fairly small. It's a little bit disappointing, to be honest. We see that in young adults, if supplementing with extra protein really seems to help to build muscle, but surprisingly in older adults, you do not really see that effect. Now, that might simply be that it takes some time, that you have to take it for a year before it really becomes noticeable. But my best guess is there's a small effect, but it's not very substantial. And that might be related that you have to do everything right. So you need the protein, but you also need the exercise, and you also need the other micronutrients. So maybe you need, the perfect storm to really maintain your muscle mass.
I think you can take supplements, but there have been a number of intervention studies with foods, including red meat and dairy products, and they've shown effects. But again, as Jorn's saying, they're really quite small. And given the rates of loss as we go anyway with aging, we're best to kind of keep trying to eat. I think I'm not certain that really having protein supplements would help people who are older. I think eating just more food in general is better if we can do it.
And I'd very quickly add that supplements in younger people are perhaps adding to the problem I mentioned earlier. We did some modeling in the United States about the amount of nitrogen pollution from the very high levels of protein which are being consumed, because people think more and more protein is better for them, and it's going to build their muscles, which for many people that's not the case, and it was actually polluting the waterways in some parts of America quite badly.
I might also very briefly say that I was showing the trajectories of the decline with age, and one of the other body compartments that's declining is kidney function. So, and once people start, very gently it's declining, but a very large load of protein could be putting too much stress on the body. So it's better to be consuming reasonable amounts as much as we can.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. Right, our next question is from Trevor Crichton. Trevor, I think we're going to get unmuted.
Interesting.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Trevor, yes.
Okay, I've got question. Is muscle mass loss irreversible, or can it be reversed in the elderly? And secondly, is there any evidence that young people who are particularly strong become more susceptible to type 2 diabetes in older age? That was specifically something which I noticed in one of Ailsa's slides. She was talking about muscle, about protein intake and diabetes.
Oh, yes, actually, just to say, I was talking more about muscle loss and diabetes. So, because muscle, once we start to lose muscle, then muscle is the tissue that's burning up energy and carbohydrate and the glucose that when those go into the body. So if we start to lose a lot of muscle, then there's less capacity to burn the glucose. But Jorn, I think did you want to answer the other question, which was?
Yeah, so for example, I think your slide showed it very well for muscle function. That's at the old age, there's quite a big range in muscle function, and that's dependent on your lifestyle. So we've done quite a few intervention studies where in a couple of months, people can build about 2 to 5 pounds of lean body mass, which is mostly muscle mass. But after that, it becomes difficult. So if you start performing resistance exercise, pay some attention to your nutrition, quite easily you build a little bit more muscle, and that doesn't necessarily drastically change your body, but your overall metabolic health and just how easy you can just walk around, that will improve quite a lot. But after the initial improvement, you're not very likely to improve further and get back to your younger years, so to speak. So it's partly reversible.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, and thank you, Trevor. Right, our next question is Julie Lovegrove. Julie?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to thank the 3 presenters for excellent presentations, really enjoyable. Jorn, you stated that physical activity is important to build and maintain muscle mass. And if you have an older person, perhaps is bedridden with sarcopenia, what's your advice about the physical activity and also the dietary protein intake in that situation?
Yes, so several studies have been performed to improve protein intake and or protein supplementation in people with bed rest. The results are not very promising. Sometimes you see a little bit of an attenuation of muscle loss, but in general, the effects are fairly disappointing. Ideally, any type of physical activity that you can stimulate would be good, because what we tend to see, for example, we see it in our own hospital, that when people are sick, the natural tendency is to protect these people. So if they have to go to the toilet, we take them in a wheelchair. Well, if they can walk, and maybe it takes them 5 minutes to walk down the hallway, supervised, which unfortunately we often don't have time for in medical care, but that would already be gigantic, because 5 minutes of walking for someone that's normally bedridden, that's like quite a workout. We've also done some research where we added electrodes to muscle, and then through an electrical signal, the muscle contracts, and you see that's quite effective at reducing muscle loss already. So that's a very weak training stimulus. If healthy adults will use it, nothing would happen, but just about anything you do compared to being bedridden is huge. So anything we can stimulate, I think we should try.
Thanks very much, Jorn.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Right, let's move on. I've got a question here from Anthony Kearns. Anthony, I think someone will unmute you, and that's going to be followed by Alan Javier Mendez Alvarez. So, Anthony, are you there? I think we lost Anthony. I can see you're still with us, Anthony. And you're...
Yes, I'm still.
Yeah, good. Fire away.
Anthony, you need to unmute.
All right. Can you hear me, please?
Mhm.
You're muted.
Yes, we
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Oh, you
yes.
can. Thank you. Right, I have a question. I think it's for Ailsa. The malnutrition figure presented by Ailsa is surprising, as we hear very much more about obesity. Which condition is more prevalent, or which should give us greater concern? Should there be a government campaign, for instance, to give us a clearer or different messaging concerning obesity or malnutrition with regards to what Ailsa has said?
Thank you, Anthony. Ailsa?
Yes, certainly obesity is a huge problem in this country with so many adults and also children who are overweight or obese. So that still needs to be of concern, but I think we could be considering micronutrient malnutrition in particular and trying to understand that more and ensuring people have a good quality of diet, not just about reducing fat and sugar to keep weight down, but actually improving other aspects of diet that are important, that I showed today, particularly important in older people, but also actually in children when they're growing, because a child who has iron deficiency can then have compromised cognitive function. And it's a particular issue in low-income countries, but there are sectors of the UK population where children will be compromised as well. So I think we need a dual approach, but my feeling is that perhaps we should be making, and the reason I talked about this today, we should be making people more aware of the diet quality issues, not just about thinking about weight, but we should be considering the whole elements of diet that actually improve our well-being.
Excellent. Anyone want to add to that?
No, I'm very happy with the answer. So, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. As I said, our next question will be from Alan Javier Fernandez.
Hello.
Where you are? Yes, sorry, Alvarez.
Can you hear me well?
Hi.
Hi. I think my question is more for Andy. Last week, I was in a forum about sustainability, and we were discussing about which are the parameters to label a protein as sustainable, as it seems that everyone has their own opinions, and I would like to know what does he think about how we can label a protein as sustainable, because even some people were discussing about if they are, for example, fair about the social impact as well. So I would like to know what he thinks about it. Thank you.
I think that it's a very good question, and not one I'm convinced I can fully answer. I think we've got an awful lot to learn still. I mean, quite clearly, excessive production of animal protein isn't sustainable, and I've shown you some of the reasons why, and the waste of natural resources potentially that go into that, which we don't get back. However, you take something like soy protein, and it's not necessarily sustainable because of the type of land it needs to grow in, and the fact that obviously we're seeing all of the forest clearance in South America to grow that. I'm not a plant scientist, but I think we need to know a lot more about the sustainability of producing nuts and various legumes in different parts of the world. And certainly, some of the things I mentioned that we're working on, things like wing bean and bambara, have the potential to grow in quite arid conditions and could be very sustainable for some parts of the world. But we have to get around this problem of the poor quality in terms of the anti-nutrients. So I've talked around it. I don't think I've answered your question, but I think it is something that we really have to start thinking about and being able to actually put a label on in terms of sustainability, because I don't think it's just a clear factor that animal protein isn't sustainable and plant protein is.
Thank you. Right. I think our next question is from Bernard Korf, and then we'll have Noel Ellis. Bernard? Maybe not. No, maybe that Bernard's dropped off, in which case can we go to Noel Ellis?
Can you hear me?
We can.
Good, thank you. I was just wanting to ask Jorn about the deficiency of amino acids in protein from certain plant sources, and really would like him to comment on the complementarity of plant protein from different sources. This is quite typically a case of eating a pulse with a cereal to balance the amino acid content. Is this not this principle of complementarity, does that not get over your problem with the what you call the poor quality of plant protein?
Yes, partly. So I use the analogy that you need bricks, windows, and doors. So if one protein source, for example, is quite rich in all the essential amino acids, but it lacks doors, for example, and another source is quite rich in essential amino acids, but it just lacks windows. When you add those two together, then you have a nice balance of everything you need. So indeed, of my list of things why plant-based proteins tend to have a lower quality, that issue can be fixed either by knowledge of the consumer who knows which meals to combine, or just by the food industry that just makes good products that are balanced. But keep in mind there are some other aspects of protein quality, such as the digestibility, that also tends to be lower. Again, there, the food industry may be of help. Just the processing of protein can help improve the digestibility. So none of the issues are like a huge obstacle. But my main concern is in the older adults, I don't see most older adults like really studying nutrition and being super aware of what they have to buy in the supermarket. So in general, I am quite supportive of a move towards more plant-based nutrition. I'm just not a huge fan of pushing it onto everyone, because I think in some populations it might backfire. But that's really the minority again.
Perhaps I could just add, I think that if you're living in a population with the income and the accessibility to a wide range of plant proteins, then you can certainly meet your requirements. And there's plenty of vegans out there who are testament to that. If you're poorer within those societies, or you're living in a poorer part of the world where perhaps you're getting most of your protein from cereal crops, which are known to be poor, then you may have difficulties.
Great, thank you both. My next question is from Andrew McKenzie. Andrew. Just remember to unmute. Fire away.
Thank you. My question is really about to Ailsa, I think, about the speed at which people would see changes in their health due to changes in nutritional balance, particularly due to older people in COVID. We know a lot of older people are shielding or worried about going out to the shops, and as a result have seen changes in their diet. How quickly would they see a negative impact as a result of that?
Are you saying how quickly would they see the results of a negative diet as opposed to positive change, or both?
As in, if they are, as a result of COVID, worried about going to the shops because they prefer to stay indoors, therefore they're getting fewer fruit and vegetables and their diet has changed, how quickly would that change in nutritional balance? So less varied, they're maybe used to get particular types of foodstuffs that they no longer do. And we saw in your presentation that obviously that can have a huge impact on health. How quickly would you expect to see that? Is it days? Is it weeks? Is it months? What kind of timescale are we talking about?
I guess it depends on the nutrients. I can't answer this exactly because I don't know the exact answer, but certainly water-soluble nutrients such as B vitamins and vitamin C and so on, they would decline faster. And the reason for that is because you need a daily dose. Those that are held in fat, such as vitamin D and some of the others like vitamin E, are less likely to be a problem because it would take long before your stores were exhausted. But I do think there's an issue in terms of micronutrient status likely and COVID susceptibility. What we know is there's a huge number of, a lot of those nutrients I was talking about today. I didn't actually talk about this because I thought it was just too much in the talk, but a lot of the nutrients are protective, particularly vitamin C, zinc, magnesium, vitamin D, and others are likely protective for the immune system, and the immune system declines as we get older. So the more help we have from the foods that contain those micronutrients, the better. So I would say it could be an issue. I don't know exactly how long it would take, but I don't think it would be a good idea for older people to be short of their usual intake of vegetables and other foods that provide them with health for very long, personally.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Ailsa. Did someone want to add to that? No? No? Okay, that's fine. Our next question is from Eric Orborn. Eric. Hopefully you will now be unmuted. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
We can indeed. So,
okay. I was just taken by Andy's slide about the increased need for protein in the coming century, and particularly that being driven by the increased need in Africa. How well are we placed to actually, as a world, to meet those needs? Does it need new technologies such as insects and whatever? Just to talk about that issue, if you could.
Certainly, and I mean, I think it's one of the major problems. I mean, it's not just protein; it's all of the nutrition that continent's going to need. And we very much hope that the countries of that continent become richer as well. And if we learn from the past, we see that in areas perhaps such as China, as they became more economically stable, their production and consumption of meat increased dramatically, and really the planet cannot sustain that increase again. So looking for alternatives, I think, is an urgent matter, both for the health of those people and to allow them to live long and healthy lives, but equally so that that growth in population and growth in consumption doesn't have the negative effects that we're seeing that our consumption has on the rest of the world. But that means we all have to change, obviously, not just tell them to change, and we'll continue to eat what we're eating at the moment.
But what changes do you see on the horizon technologically?
I think that we have to be a little bit cleverer in terms of making any changes culturally and socially acceptable, and looking at the sort of foods that they're eating and see whether we can help them in developing the production of some of them so that it can meet those increased needs. And that's why I mentioned some of the legumes which grow specifically well in those tropical climates, which are rich in protein, but maybe have some problems associated with them with these anti-nutritional factors. If we can help them to develop foods where we've got rid of some of those negative impacts, that could help quite remarkably. I think it's inevitable there will be an increase in the consumption of animal-based foods. And again, we have to help them to produce them more sustainably, which is why we're so interested in looking at alternative feeds for animals as well as alternative foods for people.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Andy. And thank you, Eric. I'm glad you could join us. Right. I tried to get a question from Bernard Korf earlier, but sadly he was unable. His microphone's not working with the system, for whatever reason. And he had a question for Jorn, which I know that you have answered in the Q&A, but I just wondered if you could just expand on that. The question was, are there any easy ways the general public can be assured their protein quality is adequate?
Yes, so there's one ties in with what we just discussed. Try to have a multi-ingredient meal that in general tends to balance out issues with specific foods or food categories. And the other aspect would be try to include a little bit of animal protein in every meal. You don't need 3 hamburgers at dinner, but if you just add 1 glass of milk at breakfast, for example, that will provide a very good basis to allow the other building blocks, the other essential amino acids in plant-based protein to do their work. So just by distributing your plant protein a little bit better over the day instead of one huge meal at dinner, you can actually reduce your total animal-based intake while improving your overall quality per meal.
Great, thank you. Now I've got 2/3 more questions, and that will probably take us to time. So the John Slater, John, if you've got a question, it's quite interesting. You're still muted by the look of it, John.
No, I shouldn't be now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Fire away.
Okay, so my question is of Andy. You talked about cricket flour. Can this be used to make pasta or bread or under the usual sort of mealy type foods that are used around the world, or does it have no particular direct application to foods we recognize?
It certainly can, and I mean, some of my colleagues have definitely been involved in trying to make pasta, and with some success. It's a high protein flour, and that has effects on the foods that you're putting it in, and getting the balance right sometimes is difficult. But there's quite a range of energy type bars which have been made from cricket. There's certain people have made bread type product as well. So that there is certainly some scope for making that sort of thing.
Can I have a supplementary? And that is that I worked in China on a few occasions, and in West China, they catch locusts and fry them, and I've had them, and they're absolutely delicious. You know, is there a benefit to be gained from locust swarms?
Yes, certainly. From what I've heard, often it's what you actually fry them in and what you add to it, which gives them the taste. They can be a bit cardboardy, I think, if they're just eaten as they are. But again, yes. And I mean, I think we can learn from, you know, as I say, there's 2 billion people on the planet who do eat insects. I don't think they get a lot of their protein or indeed energy from those insects, but they are part of the cuisine. And I think we can learn a lot from that.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Probably our penultimate question is from Mohammed Safwan Akram. Mohammed, are you there?
Hello, can you guys hear me?
We can indeed.
Hi, I work a lot with biosimilars, which are sort of like, you know, generic biological drugs, and where costs are high because of the regulatory issues and manufacturing itself is quite expensive. So when Professor Slater mentioned that alternative meat prices are quite high, my question is that, is it due to the bioprocessing costs associated, or economies of scale have not just, like we haven't yet achieved the economies of scale yet?
I mean, I don't feel completely qualified to answer that, and I'm sure some of my colleagues who might be listening who are in the food industry would have a better answer. I think it's a mixture of both. I think they are more expensive to produce at the moment. They're being sold to a relatively niche market, perhaps, and a market that can afford to pay these prices. And if we were to genuinely try to replace meat on a large scale with these things, I think that could bring the price down. It's interesting, having talked to some colleagues in industry, finding some of these plant proteins is becoming difficult. Pea protein, apparently, the cost has gone up dramatically as interest in these sort of foods has changed, and we haven't managed to increase the production enough. So agriculture has to change, and we have to keep pace with that. You know, so I think there's a mixture of factors which are adding to that cost.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Mohammed. I don't know if anyone wanted to add to that. No, in which case, I think our final question is again from Trevor Crichton. And with permission, Trevor, can I ask it for you? Because I think it's quite a good question, which is, apparently Trevor saw a documentary that said the ideal balanced diet was beans on toast. Would anyone like to comment?
Yeah, that's clearly missing coffee.
Sorry, say that again.
That diet is clearly missing coffee.
The major food groups.
It's certainly good for the protein balance, as I recall. But and you also get, there's we didn't talk today about fibre and the effects of that, and we know that that's highly important as well for gut health, and and also you get lots of those nice carotenes, which again I didn't talk to you, but you get lycopene and there's other things in baked beans, so pretty good.
Oh, good. I'm pleased about that. Andy, did you want to add anything to the culinary delights of beans on toast?
As a food which I grew up on, having many times, I think it is. I mean, it's a good example of a high protein plant food in the beans and relatively high quality as well. I'd add the odd pint of beer to that as well, but that's me being biased.
Excellent. And presumably, if you put Marmite on the toast as well, it just gets better.
Absolutely.
Yes, for sure.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you all very much indeed for your contributions this evening, and to all our attendees for their questions. Can I thank everyone for attending and organising this seminar, particularly to our three speakers, to Andy, to Ailsa and to Jorn, and of course to Mark Hollingsworth and Caroline Roberts of the Nutrition Society for your support in pulling this together. Of course, can I thank the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee team, which is Lee Jeffs, Karen Smith, Ben Allen, and I think Charlotte's here as well with us, who writes up some of these notes. Thank you for helping pull this together. Our next meeting will be a fortnight today, and that will be Monday the 9th of November at 5:30, where the theme will be preparing for the long-term impact of COVID-19 on older people, and that's being sponsored by or supported by the Physiological Society. So I thank them for helping us put that together. Please do feel free to join us at our next meeting. Once again, thank you all for your contributions, and have a lovely evening. Good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you for such great questions too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.